I have one question. Utopia opens change for the better. Is there any suspicion that Moore is a millennialist and that he is anticipating the end of days in which humanity is going to be judged finally as being the followers of the Antichrist or redeemed? And he wants to place his utopians in the redemption category?
Is this for me?
It could be for anybody. Redemption comes with your monthly salary.
I don't know. Well, I mean, certainly he believed in a second coming. Of course he did. You know, he wrote the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Meditated on those at some length. But I don't know. I would be interested in what you know, others who may have a more extensive knowledge of Moore's entire.
I'll talk to that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Exact question.
Yeah. You know, whether he believed it.
They did a good answer for us.
Whether he believed it was imminent, that I don't know. I would be interested to. So I will have to come to see Moore's paper to find out.
I guess that some of the changes taking place in 16th century England probably look like the end of the world to a certain extent. I'm focusing on economy because I think that that was one of the big, I mean, in the end, as you said, redemption comes from monthly salary. And the end of the world may mean that you lose your house and that you have to leave because there's no way you can feed your family. So to a certain extent, in a very material, I don't know about other spiritual or theological dimensions of that, but in a very material world, I believe that 16th century England, like other parts of Europe, very much looked like things were changing for the worst. Not, I don't know whether the end of the world, but certainly for the worst.
One thing I'll say, just one additional thing, is that the end of Utopia, at least reads to me like an anticipation of further dialogue into the long future. Certainly a desire as he leads Hithilday into lunch by the hand. And you know, it's a very friendly gesture. He ends by looking ahead to further conversations about these matters and a desire for further conversation. Now, whether you know that's 1516, right on the eve of you know, Luther posting his 95 Theses. Whether the world started to look very different and you know, under threat of collapse right after the publication, the first publication of Utopia, I could see that as a real possibility for more.
I don't think he was a millennialist, but he had this idea of the end of the world with 2 very clear images. One of them is the Ottoman threat. I mean, the Turks were at the gates of Vienna, and also the spread of Lutheranism and other heresies. And it is interesting to notice how Luther and More were accusing each other of being the Antichrist or messengers of the Antichrist. So from his perspective, the breaking of the Western Church might be perceived as a kind of end of the world, and also the coming of the Turks. And both things were perceived every now and then as one single issue. And I don't know.
It's okay.
I'm coming back to first to Jerry's examples of what I take to be progress, that is printing and paper making. He also mentioned another invention, the magnetic needle.
Mm-hmm.
And that is open-ended. It could be good and it could be bad, depending on where you go with it.
Right.
And that seems to me where Moore is at when he wrote the Utopia.
Yeah.
I would not know how to extrapolate that exactly to later. Because it does seem that when he's doing his polemical works, there's a different tone. But I think it's Arthur Kinney who pointed out in a lecture the dangers of the magnetic needle. That if they weren't careful, they would go too far or they would run into dangerous waters. So what that seems to suggest to me is that you can use knowledge for good or for ill, but you could also then see things opening if you use it rightly, according to the value system that we assume and I think believe that Moore had, or you can misuse it for ill. And it's like a lot of Moore. I mean, I too see him as in the Utopia ambiguous and nuanced and so on. So the other thing that has always fascinated me and which would tie in with the second speakers is that incredible war section of Utopia, which I'm afraid I read as a kind of black comedy, which is not a popular reading. But the Utopians keep getting more and more gold, for which they have no use, except to make chamber pots and gold chains, which is also, again, ambiguous, because who normally has gold chains? The ambassadors and the nobles of Western Europe. So the slaves in Utopia are loaded down with gold chains, which aren't as heavy as the ones in Western Europe. Another little hidden joke. But the other thing they use it for is to lend it out to other countries. And so they keep collecting more and more money, which they lend out to other countries. It's a weird cycle, which you could probably do more with than I can from an economics point of view. But it's a trade, but it's a weird trade where they keep getting more and more gold, which they then lend out. Then they always seem to win any battle they fight, or they use it to hire mercenaries to fight for them. So the whole war machine is being attacked also, it seems to me. Ironically, in view of what's going on in the West, where all those European countries were fighting each other all the time and hiring mercenaries. So that money, gold, and war are all tied up together. And it does...
They are. That's very interesting. I have been thinking about that as well. One thing, well, this reminds me of this contemporary concern with taking democracy to some countries so that they can have a capitalist economy and we can make business with them. That's the general idea. And this is something that we can see in Utopia, because it is true that there's this gold lending to other neighboring communities, but Hitler explains the principle is seldom reclaimed. So it's rather than we want them to be wealthy because we are happier surrounded by wealthy neighbors. They will be more content and we will have fewer problems with them. So it's like, again, the idea that money, wherever it is used, not Utopia, money should be constantly circulating. People should have money to conduct their businesses and to make trade agreements and to buy and sell stuff, although we don't need it. But in those places where it is needed, we're happy to lend them money, to see them prosper, to do business with them. And then, of course, the connection with war, with financing war, which is because we are, and this also connects with the slave thing, we need mercenaries. We pay people to kill other people. So I think that, as always in these cases, economy and ethics and society and ideology are all mixed, and they're difficult to differentiate.
I like your emphasis on the anecdote of the magnetic compass. In fact, Hinsloday himself says that utopian sailors have become more reckless once they've gotten the magnetic compass. And while it was my intention just to talk about these new technologies in terms of social permeability, openness to change, new ideas, yeah, I have to admit that just my descriptions of papermaking and print are imbued with a positive tonality. But, you know, and I tend largely to agree with your complex readings of Utopia. I don't think it's like the More of Utopia, just to give us one evaluation of anything. And one thing to do with, you know, the anecdote of the compass is to remind us that, yeah, change will come with any new, with the coming of anything new, whether it's a new discourse or a new technology. Whether or not that's good is another question, and probably is going to have multiple answers. The other so that's one of the anecdotes I've really been kind of coming back to in my reflections on Utopia. The other one has to do with print too, and that's the monkey that destroys books on board the ship as the travelers are going to Utopia. I'd love to hear any ideas people have about that. So far, the only precedent that I've been able to locate is in Francis Bacon's book on Henry VII, and I think that's the only source for the monkey that, his pet monkey that destroys a list he was keeping of his political enemies. What the connection might be, I'm still trying to puzzle out, but I think it's not unrelated to what we're talking about now.
I don't know, I have great trouble recalling every names of things I've read long ago, but a woman did an article in French on the monkey in Moore's Utopia.
Okay.
And it would be some time ago now. I've met her in Canada, and sorry, I can't recall her name.
Well, that'll narrow. I can at least search based on those details.
But this linkage of gold and war seems to me an interesting one, and it's again, I go back to high school days where we were taught that in a simple way that the Spanish did three things when they went to the New World. They did it for God, they did it for gold, and they did it for glory. And of course that's totally linked with invasion of the New World. So.
Oh yeah.
About the monkey.
Yes.
An idea just came into my head, and
Please.
I may be talking complete rubbish, but Moore had a pet monkey. And could he just have been the pet monkey and chewed some manuscript and he was just getting it off his chest?
Well, I will.
I don't know. I mean, you know, something happens.
Yeah.
And then you use the something.
Yeah.
And give them more sense of humour.
Uh-huh.
Could he just have been saying, oh, I'm going to write this?
Well, that's, as I said, this is one of the details I keep coming back to in my ongoing meditation. So I might at least cite you as a basis for the conjecture.
There is a beautiful emblem by Henry Peacham entitled "The Trade of the English," and the Englishman is represented by a monkey who is being swindled. And his theory is, just like Spaniards cheat the Indians and give them trifles for gold, we Englishmen are being swindled by the Dutch. So they give us very inexpensive and important things, and we give them our wool, and we give them our money, and we give them everything we have. It's by Henry Peacham. I think it's in Minerva Britana.
Okay.
Simon.
I have a question for Jesus. So the notion that money doesn't have, that bullion doesn't have a fixed value, that it can be used for other things and we can assign a value to it, seems like it's a kind of a new notion in the 16th century. Does that have anything to do with the influx of bullions coming from the New World, and all of a sudden there's just vast quantities of what was before quite rare? So we realize that this is the value we lay down onto a piece of silver is something notional, that it doesn't really reflect the intrinsic value of the object itself?
Absolutely. Apparently it was the School of Salamanca the first who came up with a written explanation for that, but people started to realize that gold was not that valuable in America, in the Indies. It wasn't valuable because there was so much of it. Then it traveled to Europe and it acquired more value there. But then because it kept on coming, there was an influx of bullion. There was an increase in prices. Spain went bankrupt 3 times with Philip II. And that was a paradox, because on the one hand you had the biggest gold mines in the world and the biggest silver mines in the world, but at the same time the country was broken. And gold had to keep on coming to pay Fuggers and all these bankers.
So it's like war, it just keeps happening, but
Yeah.
it lacks a meaning.
There's no way
It's
to
a perpetual
not only
cycle of
Spain,
behavior.
but other countries like England suffered from that, because that money overflowed Spain and was spread throughout Europe.
And Henry VIII had to devalue currency even though there was an abundance of oil in the
Yeah,
country.
yeah. Well, Henry VIII had 2 ways to obtain. Well, apparently when he saw how Charles V was getting that much gold from America, he couldn't. The only thing he found in America was cod and fish. He took the properties of the church and he debased the currency. So he acquired a huge amount of silver, and he didn't tell anyone. This was like a secret process.
Yeah.
They took the silver and then they threw the coins away, hoping that nobody would notice, but they noticed in Antwerp.
Also, he was getting money by loan from the bankers of Italy by loans, and one of these was Antonio Bonvisi, More's good friend, which is why More was able, among other things, to get news way ahead of other people at a time when news was valuable. Because these great bankers had their own couriers and sources of news. And the Bonvisis were strong in Lucca. And Henry VII also.
Yeah, I was going to say. Especially with the Medici.
And Henry VII, More opposed Henry VII's policies in an early parliament. So there's a personal edge to that. And
Gabriella?
I don't know, would you like to? I was just going to make a tiny point. I've always read that Catherine of Aragon's dowry was one reason why Henry married her. Because Henry had to go to the Pope to get dispensation in order to marry her. So the problem was already there, was known. But he married her because she brought such a big dowry that there was no way they wanted to send it back.
Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon because Arthur had died and the Spanish princess was already there.
Yes, with her dowry.
Right. And you know what? Fernando el Católico, his father,
Yes.
it took a long, long time to send the second part of the document. So, it was a promise, but took a long time to get there. The second part, the second half. In fact, while Catherine was a widow, she really went through serious economic problems because the money from Spain did not come.
I have a question for Jerry, maybe, or perhaps for anyone. Probably following up a little bit on what you said, Elizabeth. I'm also always fascinated by these paradoxes in utopia, the paradox that you've shown us between stasis on the one hand and change on the other hand, which is also, I think, a paradox between, or a very ambiguous definition of old and new, of model and imitation. For example, utopia is, on the one hand, it's presented to us as an ideal to imitate. On the other hand, it's a society that has been changed by this invader, Eutychus, from a country that used to be called Abraxa, and Abraxa is often read as a kind of cryptic expression of the perfect world, basically. So the perfect world has been changed into a no place, and so there's so many ironies between or contained in notions of learning, imitation, of change in the text. And my question would be, just perhaps a very wide one, but what implications does this have for our concept of utopian literature as a genre? Because it's often defined as, a model that basically arises from a lack perceived in the real society that it's based on, and the lack is then projected onto a utopian either second world or into an imaginary future in order to be imitated. And in one of the Pelaez itself, I think utopia is defined as a mirror from which we might then imitate or adapt concepts. But the fact that it's not clear at all in this text what is actually the model and what is to be imitated. Utopians are imitating Europe, are learning from Europe, and it's, on the one hand, they're precisely praised for that in the utopian quatrain, for example. They are open to change and to learning from Europe. On the other hand, according to the logic of utopian literature as a genre, Europe, or most readers in Europe, should learn from the model of utopia. So, I mean, it complicates, I think, it completely complicates our notions of what utopian literature is.
Yeah, so where's, I mean, I hear a lot of questions there, all of them good. One of them is, where's the model?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it is, I think, we do need to go back, I think, to consider that, character more, author more writes character more at the end of the book as objecting to many things about this utopian commonwealth, so that the more in the text doesn't take it as straightforward reflection of the good, a mirror for the ideal society. And yet, and Miller has pointed this out too, so one of the things that Moore says as well, I just can't see that, their community of goods, their attitude toward money, and common property. Well, it just, that does away with everything that's good and noble in life. And Miller points out, well, that's counter to so many other things that Moore has written. And even up to that point, a lot of the epigrams, his Latin epigrams, for example, are about the folly of wealth and the folly of prominence on the stage of this world. So on the one hand, we have character Moore objecting to this ideal, quote-unquote, ideal place. On the other hand, we have character Moore doing so in a way that seems counter to other things that author Moore has in fact written. So to say that Utopia is, that Moore's, the inaugural book of this genre is not exactly the reflection of an ideal place is also not to say that it's simply a dystopia. See, so I take the model to be the kind of open, remember, we're still talking about a moment in history when people were pretty comfortable talking about the status quo as, in some sense, divinely good. The kings rule by divine right. and so forth. So it's a pretty radical idea to say that, no, we need to keep sort of in a place of permanent unbalance, to continue considering possibilities of, to pray with the utopians, if there is a better way of life, please help us to know that. It seems like that's an extremely modern and precocious idea. So it seems to me that that's where the model is. It's in that attitude toward the ongoing dialogue that Moore gestures toward at the very end. So it's not a sort of complete model of society. It's a very humanist model. It's a humanist model of continuing dialogue and reconsideration.
This is a question for Jesus. I probably tend to put more weight on book one than some readers. And taking book one and thinking of what was happening in not just England, but other countries at the time, Raphael of the Deus, according to the narrative, comes from Portugal. And I was wondering at one point, before anyone was thinking about slave societies, where the slaves that he introduces in book two, what was the comparable thing in book one? And I discovered along the lines that Portugal had a huge number of slaves by the early 16th century, that Lisbon had an enormous slave society. And so I've often wondered if we shouldn't take what was happening in Portugal as seriously as what was happening in Spain, because he wrote it in presumably in 1516 and 18. So I'm just wondering what was going on in Portugal, and I don't have the answer to that question. I do know that that they had an enormous number of slaves in Lisbon, but they were and of course Hyperides went with one of the, wasn't it a Portuguese explorer? So for whatever reason, the Portuguese part has been sort of ignored by American cultural studies. I can't speak to other countries.
Isn't there a difference between the slavery in Utopia, which is a penal slavery, or other people who want to live in the prosperity join them? But it's not the slavery of Portugal or European power that goes into Africa or Asia and steals people and then enslaves them against their will.
Right. But I'm not addressing the issue of slaves in Utopia. But if we are, there were three categories. One was people of their own country who violate the basic standards. One was people that they purchase, I think, from other countries, because they save them from being killed in the other country. So it's an act of mercy, but I didn't think they got them for free. I thought they had to. Anyway, and the third category is the group, your second group, the group that came in willingly.
And could leave.
Because they lived better in Utopia than they could in their own country. They were free to go home after a certain time, but most of them did choose to stay in Utopia. And somehow when I read that in the last few years, I was thinking of the problem of the people who are fleeing from Africa and Asia to economic refugees as well as the migrants. And I mean, Moore just seems to raise questions that are so fundamental, no matter what issue we think about. But yes, and of course then they're dressed in the very things that would make them admirable models in
in Europe. So
Just a brief idea on what you mentioned.
yeah,
The Portuguese nature of his Judaism is very, very interesting because there was a strong, we all know, strong Portuguese Jewish community in Central Europe. After 1492 in Spain and a few years later in Portugal, they had to flee. But also about slavery, there's a colleague and friend who's now retired, Gustav Ungerer, a German scholar, who has very convincingly argued with documentary sources that slave trade was being conducted by English merchants in Andalusia in the early 16th century.
I bet.
So not just the Portuguese who were into that and the Spaniards, but there were quite a few English tradesmen buying and selling people in Seville, in the Canary Islands, and in the Azores and in Portugal.
And there is a distinction between the slavery or slave trade and the slave, the native or the slaves as a task force, because there were slaves in Spain and Portugal, but they usually remind more the use of slaves in Utopia than the slaves that were sent to America. That is, they were usually domestic slaves that eventually could obtain their freedom. They could even marry other Spaniards, you know. There is a very curious story that in the Easter celebrations, you know, that they have fellowship, and there is a still fellowship. And in Seville, for instance, there were several fellowships that were only of black slaves. And then all of them were, black, except the secretary that was white, because he was the only, a black slave was not supposed to write. And then it was, there is still now a fraternity that is called the Fraternity of the Black, Cofradía de los Negros, and there is from 1750 or something, there is no black. What happened to those black people? I mean, they melted into the population, and still the name, so that, and we have a lot of references to domestic slaves, even in Scotland, for instance, in many. And then I think that distinction is interesting. Some of them were used for trade, and they were sent to America, but some other people remained in Spain, and then they were not exploited on an economic basis, like plantation and all those things.
Did the Moors have slaves before they were expelled and the reconquest in Spain?
I'm sorry?
Did the Moors, did the Islam culture have slaves,
Yeah,
domestic slaves? What happened to those slaves? Were they expelled too, or were they?
Well, you know that the expulsion of the Muslim population in Spain took several stages and happened in several. So all those who baptized and converted were originally allowed to stay. But in 1609 was the great expulsion, and they all had to leave. They all had, well, except those very special cases in which the Moorish population was like 50–60% of a region, so they couldn't be expelled because then the region's economy would collapse.
Yeah.
So they were allowed to stay. But all of them had to leave, yes, because all the slaves of the Muslims had to be Muslims. I mean, a Muslim could never have a Christian slave. So they have to leave with their masters, yes.
Last question.
Is it true that a lot of the slaves that were present there in Lisbon were black?
I'm sorry that...
So, is it true that a lot of slaves, as Elizabeth mentioned, in Lisbon has a very big slave market, were many of them black?
Yeah, well, yeah, sure, because the Portuguese were trading in Africa.
Yeah. Because there is a connection with the name of Moros directly. And another thing why maybe Portugal is mentioned as the country of origin, late 15th century, the Portuguese were very active in discoveries, and they end up in India, where they created first settlements. Actually, because they were searching for a mythical kingdom, High Priest John, who would be Christian. They located somewhere in India or Ethiopia,
God.
And yeah, and they thought, they really believed it, that there was like a huge Christian empire somewhere they didn't know of, and they were really serious in trying to
And they were,
find.
they were probably referring to Ethiopia,
Probably, yeah.
the Christian community
Yes,
in
yes.
Ethiopia.
They were really believing it and trying to find them to make a strategic alliance to then together further conduct the Reconquista to actually attack the Muslim
Christian,
countries
yeah.
from both sides. So I think that's maybe also linked to Christian reorientation. Or,
Let us thank our speakers and yourselves.